Hello, my name is Dr. Anthony Amstutz, Adult Services Specialist at Muncie Public Library.
Hello, my name is Sara McKinley, Local History and Genealogy Supervisor at Muncie Public Library. Today we'll be presenting together the history of the Mark III Tap Room, an ongoing community history project initiated by Muncie Public Library in July 2018. The Mark III Tap Room is known as the oldest gay bar in Indiana and has operated here in Muncie since 1968. The idea to begin collecting the Mark story from the community began when Anthony read an article in the local newspaper.
Yes, the Mark History Project began after I read in the Muncie Star Press that the Mark had celebrated its 50th anniversary. I quickly did the math in my head, and I realized that this means that not only is the Mark the oldest gay bar in Indiana, but also is actually older than Stonewall. I was kind of thrown by the fact, and I was sort of struck with the sense of wonder that for decades, back in the late 60s, going into the 70s and 80s, there must have been a thriving, living, breathing community of LGBT people who had come together and created a demand for such an establishment as the Mark. And ever since then, I've had this burning curiosity. Who were they? Who are they? How did they find each other? How did they feel about themselves? How did they feel about members of the greater Muncie community? I don't know how else to describe it than to say that I feel so unapologetically nosy about the entire matter. There isn't anything about this topic I don't find fascinating, so I brought this up to Sara, and we decided that this would make a wonderful library program and something that should be archived because it celebrates local history as well as documents the oral history of a marginalized community. There is not enough thanks and appreciation that we can express for the Mark's current owners, father and daughter Keith and Natasha Martz. They have been unceasingly generous with their time and candor. Not only did they let us interview them, but they pointed us into the direction of others who have contributed their stories to this project. Much of what we have found has been through word of mouth. It was amazing how, in speaking to someone, we would learn of a new set of names that led to another set of names. I like to think of this as the Rainbow Crumb Trail. We have come to realize that what we are presenting has really been just a beginning of a much larger story. By learning about the history of the Mark, we have gained insight into the LGBT community of Muncie these last 50 years, and not surprisingly, we have gained a further perspective into the history of Muncie as a whole. It has been our hope that others will continue to come forward and tell us their experiences at the Mark so that their stories can be added to this ongoing project.
Yes, as Anthony said, this is a living, breathing project. We started with gathering our initial stories, and then I delved into newspaper archives and historical records to try and begin filling in the missing details. We know there are more stories out there and hope to continue building on what we've collected.
As I said earlier, the Mark III Tap Room is older than Stonewall. 2019 marked the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion of 1969, and the Mark had opened in 1968. The Stonewall riots were a series of demonstrations by the LGBT community in response to a police raid that occurred at the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan. The Stonewall Inn was a popular place for the poor and marginalized people in the gay community, and police raids on gay bars were routine in the 1960s. The raid resulted in protests and riots that lasted for days, but the result of this demonstration was the formation of activist groups who had tried to establish safe places for gays and lesbians to be open about their sexual orientation without fear of being arrested. In 1970, the first gay pride marches took place on the anniversary of the riots and are now held annually to commemorate the milestone in establishing gay rights.
With that story in mind, it's significant to say that a year before Stonewall occurred, when it was still very unsafe for the gay community to be open about their sexuality in public, the Mark III Tap Room was established in 1968 in Muncie and celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2018. It was not only the first somewhat openly gay business in Muncie, but it was known as the oldest operating gay bar in the state of Indiana. Prior to the Mark III Tap Room, most businesses owned by the LGBT community, or known as hangouts for the LGBT community in Muncie and across the country, were known by word of mouth and kept mostly a secret or a rumor. During our interviews and research, we learned about a few of the places in Muncie that were known mainly by word of mouth as being LGBT-owned or LGBT-friendly.
We learned that the Blue Dipper on West Memorial Drive, for example, was a restaurant that many locals have said was owned by a lesbian couple, Shirley Ann Barnett and Bernice Berkey. The Blue Dipper confectionery and package store was known for their 10-cent hamburgers and was owned by both Shirley and Bernice for 25 years. After Bernice died in 1988, Shirley enjoyed writing and owned the Blue Dipper Antique Shop. The Marks owner, Keith Martz, recalled in one of his interviews that the Blue Dipper was a big deal in his family, as his mother would take them there on payday to get their 10-cent hamburgers.
Another well-known establishment in the community was the Carriage House restaurant on Kilgore Avenue, which opened in 1961 and was owned by a gay couple, Bob McCurdy and Chuck Hughes. Located on the Otto Carmichael estate, it was a restaurant highly regarded for its food. The first floor offered a bar, tables and chairs, television set, and movie screens for nightly movie features at the bar. Downstairs was the formal dining room. The Carriage House would also host drag performances. Everyone knew it was owned by a gay couple and that they had drag shows, and that it was patronized by the gay community. But it was also patronized by a wide portion of the community because they had such a following for their food. One of their specialties were their twice-baked potatoes. I found out that my parents actually had their wedding reception dinner at the Carriage House in 1980. Jay Jones, who we interviewed, recalled that in the Carriage House's prime, it was the place that the university or city officials would bring guests to for dinner when they were visiting Muncie. Keith Martz recalled that his daughter Natasha attended her first drag show around age 11 or 13 at the Carriage House. The first drag queen she saw perform was Jay Jones, performing as his drag persona, Kimberly Johnson.
The Alcazar Bar at 117 West Main Street was also known to have drag shows late at night, and many have said it was secretly a gay bar. One of our colleagues who grew up in Muncie recalled riding downtown in the late 1960s with her brothers late at night and parking nearby to watch the drag queens leave the Alcazar. The bar was eventually razed in 1973, along with several other buildings in the Bennett block, and once stood close to where the Mitz bus station is now. Other than those few businesses we've mentioned, the places that were known to the gay community as places to meet were the public parks, such as McCullough Park, or the adult bookstores. We found out that Muncie had quite a few adult bookstores at one time, and they weren't anything like the adult novelty stores we have today. Unlike the Mark, the adult bookstores were subject to police raids, and Muncie would eventually drive the adult bookstores out of town. But back then, they were popular places for the gay community to meet. People would also cruise to downtown square or park downtown to meet.
Having a few establishments already that were known as friendly establishments to the queer community in Muncie, even if in secret, helped lay the groundwork for opening a publicly gay bar. It was Ralph Hannon who had accomplished this milestone in Muncie by opening the Mark III tap room. This is a picture of Ralph at the Mark in 1974. Now, if you're wondering why is it called the Mark III, we probably know what you're thinking, and no, there was never a Mark I or a Mark II. The official story that has been passed down is that at the time that Ralph decided to open his bar, he and a friend had been saving money to purchase Lincoln Continental Mark III cars. But in order for Ralph to purchase both a bar and then the three-way liquor license for $5,000, it took all the money he had. He needed a business partner, and in agreeing to help him out, his friend said, "Well, I guess this will be my new Mark III." And thus the name of the Mark III tap room was born. The Mark's first home was on Walnut Street, in a building that was leased for about a year, and it sat in a lot that today is a parking lot. After the lease was up, the bar moved to its location at 107 East Main Street. This building on Main Street was formerly home to many businesses dating all the way back to the late 1800s. This Sanborn map from 1892 shows that the brick building on this lot once sold agricultural implements, sewing machines, and seeds. Further west on Main Street, the Alcazar's lot was formerly occupied by a clothing store in the late 1800s. A few of the other businesses that occupied the Mark's address on Main Street over the years included the Carl Janney Shoe Store, People Home and Savings Association, and Smith Alsop Paint Company. The famous neon sign and the bar top for the Mark were actually obtained when Ralph purchased the furnishings from the historic Delaware Hotel that was set to be torn down in 1970. The hotel was being demolished in order to build a new office building, which is where Muncie Power Products is now located. Ralph purchased everything from the tavern, which was called the Del Mar Lounge, and put it into the Mark. The Delaware Hotel was built in 1903 at the southeast corner of Mulberry and Jackson. The hotel was owned by Theodore F. Rose, who was also the president of the Muncie Public Library Board. Both the hotel and the Carnegie Library were built the same year, just a block away from each other. We haven't found any pictures of the Del Mar Lounge inside the hotel yet to see what the Mark's furniture and sign looked like in its original bar, but you can see views of the hotel lobby from these old postcards that we have at the library. The photos of the matchbooks shown here were shared on the Lost Muncie Facebook group and came from the Del Mar Lounge. These were found by Dave Ring when cleaning out the old Arthur Murray dance studio above downtown Farmstand. They look to be dated from around the 1950s or 60s. The Del Mar Lounge advertisements are from the Muncie newspapers in the 1940s and 1960s.
We're still seeking out stories from the first few years that the Mark was open, but the earliest memory of the Mark gathered from our interviews comes from Jay Jones, the drag performer we mentioned earlier who performed at the Carriage House. He grew up in Randolph County and says that even people who lived in the smaller farm communities knew about the Mark III tap room. Mr. Jones recalled that at that time the parks were still a popular place to meet, and in 1976, after meeting up with a friend of his and his friend's partner at the park, he went to the Mark for the first time. He was in his mid-20s in 1976 and was hooked after his first visit to the Mark. He became an avid patron from the 1970s to the 1990s. He recalled that the Mark was a very different place when he first went there. It had started out with drag shows, but by that time Jay started going in 1976. Ralph had stopped scheduling drag shows. The bar was very reserved, and there was a waitress there named Maggie, who Jay described as having an eagle eye. There was a very small dance floor, with beads hanging down in the doorway, and Maggie would watch through the beads to make sure there was nothing inappropriate happening on the dance floor. But it was still a place that they could meet and be themselves, and everyone had a lot of fun. Now, since the Mark wasn't hosting drag shows as part of its entertainment during the mid-1970s, a lot of people would also drive all the way to Piqua, Ohio, to a bar called the Water Main, which was on the corner of Main and Water Street. The Water Main would also hold drag contests, and one night some of Jay's friends were joking and saying that he could never do drag because he was too big. Just to prove them wrong, he and one of the locals went shopping for supplies to get him into drag, and he competed and won the contest. They told him that since he won, he now needed to do drag shows. He had no interest in taking it further, but after talking him into it, he started performing drag shows at the Water Main, and it was around this time that the Mark sort of started losing business as people were going over to the bar in Piqua. A young man named Tim Schock, who had the nickname Crusher because of his large physical build, was at the Mark at this time and was a big fan of the drag shows. He helped convince Ralph to begin offering drag shows at the Mark again. From about 1977 to 1992, Jay continued to perform drag under his name Kimberly Johnson and performed at both the Carriage House and the Mark. It was common for people to have dinner at the Carriage House and then head over to the Mark afterwards. This is a photo of an early drag performance at the Mark of a number that Keith recalls seeing there when he was around 23 years old. Jay said that his drag mama, his mentor in the art of drag, actually used to work at the Alcazar, the bar that had closed on Main Street in 1973.
The first time Keith Martz went to the Mark III tap room was around 1978 to 79. He was very nervous about going the first time. A lot of people in Muncie knew that the Mark III was a gay bar, and so sometimes people were scared to be seen going in and of being judged for it. Keith parked down the street and walked to the Mark so that his car wasn't seen parked there. He really didn't know what to expect once he got through the front doors. The first time he stepped in, there was an immediate departure from the world outside. The room was decked out in a circus theme and leopard print with a miniature train track that went around the top of the room. The bar was lined with booths, and it was a very friendly, cozy, and fun atmosphere. Keith had an amazing time and felt very welcomed. He recalled that it stayed true that if you were new to the Mark, it wasn't likely that you'd stay a wallflower for long, as everyone was very good about talking to new people and making them feel a part of the group. That's something that Keith said he feels is very important to carry on today, making sure to welcome new visitors and make them feel included. As anyone who was at the Mark in the old days will remember, the furniture was all booths, which made it difficult to turn around and see the shows. Eventually, the booths were replaced with chairs arranged for people to be able to see the shows better. Wednesday, Fridays, and Saturdays were the busiest nights because of the late-night drag shows. In the early days, the Mark was open at lunchtime, and a variety of people would stop by at lunch to have a drink and go home around dinner time before the evening crowd came. Since the shows were always very late at night, Keith remarked that there was a saying, "All the gays come out at night." The bar would get very busy at about 11 o'clock at night and would remain busy until closing. Karaoke was also popular, but the drag shows were the main entertainment. Back then, everyone was close-knit and friendly. Keith said, Muncie never really had cliques the way that the bigger cities did. In Indianapolis, there were leather bars, lesbian bars, drag bars, all different kinds. There weren't choices like that in Muncie. Everyone had to get to know each other and accept each other. You were in a very confined space, so if you wanted to spend time in a place with someone that you had something in common with, you needed to get to know everybody else too. However, very rarely would you go to the Mark and see anyone who was straight back then. Whereas today, drag shows bring in a very mixed audience, even within the gay community. Couples love to watch drag shows, as the art of drag has caught on with the mainstream. It's not just something for gay people now, as Keith put it.
The Mark was and is a place for people to go and be themselves, feel safe, and find people that they have something in common with. It's always had the same friendly, welcoming atmosphere and has reached a broader audience today. Keith shared 2 stories that demonstrated to him how people were welcoming and looked out for each other. First, when Keith first began going to the Mark, he worked at a job where the shifts ended late, so often he arrived at the Mark after 11 p.m. when the shows had already started. The stage was set at the front and the room was always so packed that by the time he got there was never any tables or booths anywhere. There were only 10 tables at the bar and back bar where everyone stood. You could barely get through. Keith was also very short, so he couldn't really see the shows over the crowd. Once the owner, Ralph Hannon, got to know Keith, he would have a case of beer on the floor that he would slide over to him when he got there so that he could stand on it and see over the taller people and enjoy the show.
In the second story Keith shared, he mentioned that he was not a drinker. But of course, going to a bar, people would try to be friendly and offer to buy him drinks. He was a single dad, though, who needed to be able to drive home to his daughter, so of course he declined the drinks. The bartender noticed this and told him that whenever someone offered to buy him a drink, to just ask the bartender for a fruit sickle, and he would fix him up. The fruit sickle was actually just cranberry and orange juice mixed together, but it would look like he had an alcoholic beverage without having to drink any alcohol. Keith said that was the type of place that the Mark was. You could be who you were and never felt pressured into anything. No one made you feel like you had to drink to be a part of the crowd. And you became acquainted with people and became friends with them.
Over the years, Keith had the opportunity to meet a lot of entertainers. Many of them would come into Muncie from Indianapolis and other cities and would go to Keith's house to get ready for their shows. That's when his daughter Natasha first had the opportunity to see their craft, and she helped them get ready. Everyone became very close.
Yes, this closeness was both a blessing and heartbreaking when dealing with the AIDS epidemic beginning in the 1980s, as it took its toll on the community. We didn't have the medical advances that there are today. Keith's own brother died at age 35 of AIDS, and many of the entertainers and patrons of the Mark were taken too. People weren't living with AIDS for 25 or 30 years. If you contracted AIDS back then, it was a death sentence. You were going to die. It was a challenge to find some of the entertainers from the Mark's past when the Martzes were planning the Mark's 50th anniversary celebration, as so many of them have since passed on. Keith remembers friends who became very sick and were in nursing homes because they had no other place to go. He remembers on Christmas going to a nursing home and helping to feed a couple of his friends from the Mark. Due to the process of the disease, these friends had lost their eyesight. They had no family, so he would go out and feed them and spend time with them. Keith said everyone who went to the Mark did these things because they were so close-knit. Muncie was a very small community, and the gay community took care of what they could in order to help each other, especially for those that had no one else. Keith always thought that was something very special about the Mark III.
The Mark was like one big family. It was important for them to support each other, to mourn together, and celebrate their victories together. The Mark often held benefit shows to help pay for the funeral expenses of those who died. Entertainers would do some of their signature numbers in remembrance of people who passed away. During holidays, the Mark still hosts Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner carry-ins because that's their extended family, and for some it may be their only family. Even back when Ralph Hannon owned the Mark, Jay Jones recalls that the Mark would be open on Thanksgiving, so after people had their family dinners, they'd often go to the Mark afterwards to sort of let their hair down and be themselves. The large Christmas wreaths in the background of these photos were made by Katie's Flower Shop, which was owned by Ed Perry, a longtime friend of the Mark.
Our next story came from Dane Van Adder. In Keith's experience, the Mark had been known to be a gay bar, but to others like Dane, the Mark was more of a mystery. He had grown up in Muncie. His father was the chief of police in the 1960s, and his mother worked for Ball department stores. As a child, Dane remembers references to the Mark III tap room as being, quote, where the queers hang out. It wasn't used in a kind context, but he always was intrigued by the mystery of it. What was going on behind those doors? To him, it was always presented as a rumor. Growing up knowing he was gay, he felt like he was the only one in the world like him, until he befriended Joe Cloyd, who attended Cowan High School with him. They were both gay, but didn't talk about it. They were too young to go into bars, but would peek in the window to try and see something. Joe later contracted AIDS and died in 1988. He was one of the longtime survivors who made it 2 years with the disease. Through work on the AIDS quilt in Boston after Joe's passing, Dane found a relationship with a man named Carl. The following year, in 1989, Dane decided to come back and visit Muncie and bring his new partner with him. He'd been telling him that they needed to visit the Mark III tap room because it was always rumored as gay, but he never knew anyone who went in or out of it. They finally arrived to the Mark on a sunny summer day in their t-shirts and shorts. It's the middle of the day, and they see that there are some people sitting at the bar and a bartender. The first thing Dane does is go to the cigarette machine, because he said that's the first place you're going to see newspapers on top of. And that newspaper would tell you right away if you were in a gay bar or not. So they walked in the door and see a cigarette machine immediately to their left. The newspaper was clearly a gay and lesbian publication like many he'd seen before, but he thought it was interesting that it was a tri-state publication that covered Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. He found it funny that the city and state couldn't put together a gay newspaper, but 3 states together were able to. He couldn't contain his excitement as he marveled at the fact that he was in a gay bar in his hometown. The rumors were true. He was going to experience it with his new partner. As he sat at the bar and began to take in his surroundings, he noticed the people sitting at the bar. They looked as if they could have been filming a movie about gay bars pre-Stonewall. The other patrons were sitting there on a hot, beautiful sunny day in heavy, dark clothing, some in black jeans and sunglasses. Everyone at the bar had sunglasses on, as if they were all undercover and incognito. The bartender was dressed like the Marlboro Man in a plaid shirt and jeans. As Dane looked to see what liquor and snacks they had behind the bar, he saw that, whereas most bars would have snacks like bags of chips, there was a refrigerated glass case with single-serve cans of Dinty Moore beef stew. Things were becoming more surreal, and as he tried to strike up a conversation with the bartender about growing up in Muncie and being home for a visit and so on, the bartender seemed nice but disinterested, and none of the other patrons would look at them. They didn't share Dean's gleeful enthusiasm, but still feeling like he was the king of Muncie for a day, he got his drink and decided to explore the bar further. He found the incredible banquettes that he described as looking like they came out of a 1950s or 60s dive bar, and beyond that, a dance floor. Crossing the dance floor to check out the restrooms, he spotted the requisite disco ball, but also a light bulb hanging without a shade or a cover. He recalled thinking this is something else that seemed pre-Stonewall. He'd heard stories from the era, when police raided the gay bars, that if the light bulb came on, the bar patrons knew to change partners. Men danced with women, and women danced with men, so that they wouldn't be hauled off to jail. Making his way to the bathroom, he was surprised to see a dirty cloth hand towel hanging down to the floor, similar to gas station restrooms. It was an interesting and unique phase that the Mark must have been going through at this point, and perhaps it was due to the devastating effects the AIDS epidemic had on the gay community. During the day, at least, the Mark had become a quieter place, perhaps.
Another decade passed, and Keith and Natasha Martz by this time were longtime patrons and avid show attendees. By the mid-2000s, they noticed that the Mark was being neglected. It was operating off of a catering license and was only open a few nights a month. The Mark no longer had the liquor license, the sound system had gone down, and they were doing shows all the time using the catering license just to stay open. Keith and Natasha knew the bar owner, and as soon as she knew it was coming up for sale, she contacted Natasha. The owner knew the Martzes would keep it as a gay bar, but that wasn't as likely with any other buyer. Natasha and Keith knew it was a viable and necessary business for Muncie, but it was a scary time and would be difficult to maintain without a liquor license. After giving up hope 8 months later, the manager called and said they have found a liquor license in Delaware County, and shortly thereafter, the Martzes signed the sale papers in August of 2012. There was already an event planned the night that they took ownership, so right after the event ended, they got the keys and went in on a Saturday night to get to work. They replaced bathroom floors, installed a new sound system and lighting, and a new floor behind the bar. The following Saturday night, after only being closed for 5 days, they had their grand reopening. Keith said the grand reopening event in 2012 was amazing because people had been so worried that the Mark wasn't going to reopen. They were ecstatic to see it reopen so soon. Over the years, the Mark has seen their family grow beyond their own walls. Their family is also downtown. It's the other business and patrons who look out for each other. In the early days of the Mark in the 1960s and 70s, there were stories about bricks occasionally being thrown through the front window of the tap room, or of people driving by yelling insults or slashing car tires of parked cars in the middle of the night. It happened often enough that the building was altered to no longer have a window out front. There was never any violence towards the Mark that we know of, but vandalism and verbal abuse from the general public was not unheard of. The downtown area, which had originally been a thriving part of Muncie, did go through a dark period of time when it was almost completely devoid of retail and dining. In recent years, it has accomplished a complete turnaround. More housing and parking is available, and more businesses have brought people back to the downtown area. The other businesses are quick to support each other to see the downtown succeeds. If one of the bars has a problem with a patron who has been kicked out, they will let the Mark and the other businesses know in order to keep them safe. When the Mark was in the process of leaving its location on Main Street, State Representative Sue Arrington contacted the Martzes to see if there was anything she could do to help out. Other businesses also contacted them to offer their support.
The Martzes knew they wanted to keep the building downtown. The building they chose on Walnut was originally an old motion picture theater called the Columbia Theater. It was listed on city directories as operating between 1917 to 1927. During the silent film era, live organ music was played during films. Over the years, several other businesses occupied the building, including H.L. Green Company department stores, Walgreens, the Muncie Children's Museum, and Center Stage. For a brief time, it was reopened as Columbia Theater, a live music venue that paid tribute to the old Columbia Theater. Owned by Michael Wolfe, this new building has allowed the Mark to do some things that they couldn't do at the old location on Main Street. They have a larger stage, which allows them to do live theater productions, live bands, and burlesque shows in addition to the drag shows. They've also had EDM parties, DJs, light shows, comedy shows, and Rocky Horror. Cornerstone and Minnetrista have been big supporters and partners. Aspire Indiana does private HIV and AIDS testing at the Mark and gives out educational information and does follow-up. Mr. and Miss Gay Indiana have been crowned at the new location, including Indiana drag performer Blair St. Clair, who later went on to perform on RuPaul's Drag Race.
Over the years, the Mark has actually had a lot of celebrities come through. Robert Reed, who played the father on the Brady Bunch, has been here. Jesse Tyler Ferguson from Modern Family has also visited. Co-owner Natasha Martz admitted she didn't know who Jesse was at first and even asked for his ID. The people with him laughed as he had to show his ID. It wasn't until a little later that people told her who he was. They say you never know who might wander through the door.
Speaking of wandering through the Mark's front doors, Keith and Natasha described the Mark's grand reopening on Walnut Street as being like every nightclub owner's dream come true. Every club owner hopes that they have lines for people to get in, and then it happened. The whole night, their heads were down making drinks at the bar, and they barely had a chance to even look up. They said it was very surreal. They kept hearing from people that they had to wait an hour to get in, but they never had a chance to really look around to see the lines outside. They had all of their staff who had worked for them before, their family, and their friends helping, and it was non-stop from the time they opened their doors. No one went to the bathroom or had a break. All 3 bars were full the whole night. By the time they had cleaned up the bar and had gone home, they realized, oh no, we have to be back at the bar in 3 hours to open up again. It wasn't until that day when they saw the pictures in the Star Press newspaper that it finally sunk in just how big a night it had been and why they were so exhausted.
So immediately the Mark's new location was a success, and it's evident that it is an important part of the downtown and Muncie community. Another visual example of the Mark being an integral part of downtown, the mural painted on the side of the current Mark III tap room, was a project of the We're Trying Collective, a group of artists who live and work in Muncie. It incorporates the pink and blue colors from the transgender flag, and teal from the Downtown Development Campaign, orange inspired by the caffeinery, and bright green that nods to surrounding business logos. It includes small equal signs symbolizing equal rights, and a stylized hand pattern to encourage people to touch the hands and interact with the design. Unfortunately, the mural was one of many buildings to fall victim to a late-night spree of vandalism downtown, and thankfully a group of volunteers came together to repair the mural, showing once again how much people value the Mark, the downtown community, and keeping Muncie a welcoming place to live and work. The community's support goes beyond just downtown. On the night of the shooting of the Pulse nightclub in Orlando in 2016, the Mark organized a candlelight vigil. Kids baked cookies and dropped them off to Keith and Natasha, and there was an outpouring of love and support from the community. When Keith left the Mark that night, he was amazed to see City Hall lit up in rainbow colors.
So as you can see, we've only scratched the surface of the stories that are out there about the Mark III taproom and Muncie's LGBT community history. We are still actively collecting stories and hope that if anyone has a story or photos to share, that they contact us via the Contact Us link at munciepubliclibrary.org. We're recording the Mark's history for future generations, and the history we collect will be made available via the library's local history archives as well as our website.
Again, we want to thank Keith and Natasha Martz and all of those we have interviewed. We hope you have enjoyed learning about this local Indiana landmark.